Well, everyone, once again, I'm very honored to welcome into the podcast Colonel Douglas Macgregor, one of the best insiders into all things Russia, Ukraine, but also geopolitics around the world. Colonel, how are you today?
Great, Cyrus. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, Colonel, we've got the entire world is watching Washington, D.C. We've seen an amazing meeting between Putin and Trump in Alaska. We've got all the European leaders there in Washington, D.C. meeting with Trump. I'd like to get your initial reaction to what's transpired over the last couple of days as the whole world is looking at Russia, Ukraine, and wondering if we are actually going to get an end to this war.
Well, that's the critical question. I think the war is coming to an end. It's not necessarily going to end because of anything that's happened in Alaska or anything going on in Washington right now. The front in Ukraine has effectively collapsed. There simply are no more human beings to man fortifications and defenses, no one to carry weapons and go into battle to defend this regime in Kiev. So I think at this stage, it's kind of a mop-up exercise because the Russians want to be sure that nothing is left behind them. In other words, as they move forward, they want to be certain there's no resistance behind them at all, as well as in front of them. So I think that much is clear. So this will come to some sort of an end. But I think what we've been witnessing in Alaska is a little different from what a lot of people expected. I think the Russians made it very clear that their positions are effectively unchanged. And you'll remember there's this alleged willingness to quote unquote swap territory. Well, that never was true at all. But what the Russians did say is that they would be willing to consider adjustments to where troops were in Kherson and Zaporizhia. These are in the southwest of eastern Ukraine. But that was about it. Otherwise, I think President Trump walked out understanding that Ukraine is going to have to be neutral. It can never join NATO. And the Russians are not going to accept anything less than that. And they want this regime to be gone. You know, they're not going to allow a regime to stay in power that is incurably hostile to Moscow. They don't want to have to refight this war in another 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Now, when it comes to Washington, for the first time, I felt a little sympathy for the Western globalists that are running the show in Europe, because it looked to me as though President Trump had convened his own private reality TV show. Because all of this was broadcast. These people trooped in a little row, all sat there representing what people were openly calling vassal states and listening to whatever Trump said. And Trump listened to them and was reasonably polite, but largely dismissed most of what they said and tried, I think, to reiterate what he had learned at the conference with President Putin. And I think Zelensky has already absolutely disavowed any willingness to cooperate at all on any territorial arrangement that does not restore everything to him, which of course is absurd. And as long as he stays committed to that, I don't think there's going to be any sort of formal end to anything. But I think he certainly stands an excellent chance of being awakened by Russians in Kiev. And I think that could absolutely happen unless there is suddenly dramatic change. He disappears. Someone else steps forward to represent what's left and is willing to negotiate directly with the Russians and is somebody they think they can trust. And that is a big issue here. Trust.
Right.
Why should the Russians trust in anything? And, you know, President Trump made a comment within the last couple of days that I thought was outrageously stupid, to be blunt. He talked about Americans being part of some sort of force potentially on the ground in Ukraine as a result of any security arrangement. Well, that's an impossibility. They just fought a war to make sure nothing like that happens. So I'm not sure he's clear in his mind, but I do know that Mr. Putin is absolutely clear about what he wants, and that's what's going to happen.
Everyone, interviews like this are not found on mainstream media, and it's why it's so important to have independent voices directly here on YouTube so that we can educate you, the public, about what's really happening in the real world. But give me 1 minute of your time, as I want to give a huge thank you to today's video sponsor, Nomad Capitalist, who makes interviews like this possible. You see, last September, I personally flew to Malaysia to attend the 2024 Nomad Capitalist Live event. And honestly, it was like hearing a real-life case study of everything I discuss directly here on this YouTube channel. The company's CEO, Mr. Andrew Henderson, started a global company, but was frustrated by huge tax bills. So he decided to build a framework, which turned into Nomad Capitalist. And honestly, it's an incredible company that can help you prepare for a plan B. Nomad Capitalist helps you legally reduce your taxes, acquire a second passport, but most importantly, go where you're treated best and give you the tools and the knowledge you need to make all of this possible. I'm actually going back to Malaysia next month to keynote speak at the 2025 event. I'm going to be giving a speech entitled The Future of Multipolarity, and it's exactly the kind of topics that I discuss here on this YouTube channel. If you're interested in learning more about Nomad Capitalist or attending the live event next month with me in Malaysia, simply go to nomadcapitalist.com/live to learn more. We're going to drop the links to this down in the description below. But now, let's get back to our interview with the Colonel.
Colonel, I want to talk about this difference between a peace agreement and a ceasefire. These two words have been thrown out, and it's actually a very crucial part of this because it seems that Trump, is very willing to accept Putin calling for this peace agreement rather than a ceasefire. And can you just explain to the audience the difference and why NATO would much rather have a ceasefire and why Putin wants to have a peace agreement?
Well, a ceasefire implies no arrangement. Simply what you hear, a ceasefire. Everybody stops shooting at each other, and that means that there are no restrictions on what either side can do. That means that in addition to evacuating wounded, you can also bring in new forces, new equipment, new capabilities. Ceasefire is just that. We all agree that at such and such a time, we will stop fighting each other. How long will that last? As long as both sides are willing to do it. There is nothing permanent about it. There is nothing that contributes necessarily to a peace agreement, which is ultimately what at least President Trump says he wants, right, and is what President Putin wants. You can continue to fight and still negotiate a peace treaty. Now, people think that's unusual. No, it isn't at all. That's happened many, many times in many, many wars where people said, fine, let's talk while we're fighting.
Right.
And obviously, whenever the fighting stops, wherever we are, based on the peace arrangements that we've made, we'll abide by those. But right now, until there is an agreement that stipulates certain conditions, where will the border run, who is in charge, and so forth, we'll continue to fight. There's nothing wrong with that. That makes great sense, and that is the standard operation, if you will, in European history. Not, let's have a ceasefire. Remember that the Germans negotiated with the Allies long before they had a ceasefire on 11 November. The ceasefire that occurs at 11 o'clock on 11 November in 1918 is a result of a peace agreement.
It's interesting, Colonel. I do see a bit of change, in this meeting with Trump and Zelensky. For example, his last visit to the White House, there was obviously a very public display of Trump certainly telling Zelensky, look, you don't have the cards. You're not in a position here. Many people felt that, Trump had thrown Zelensky under the bus. And now things had seemed to be very different. We've now seen Zelensky. He upgraded his T-shirt into a suit. I think that everybody was having a laugh about that. It definitely seemed to be a much more positive meeting, for Zelensky and the Europeans. But how do you feel, how do you think Zelensky and the Ukrainian people are taking these latest developments from the White House? Are they looking at that as a positive? Are they feeling, hopeful for the future? How do you interpret this?
Well, my information suggests that the Ukrainians want an end to the war overwhelmingly. I also am getting a lot of information that suggests that they would like to be rid of Mr. Zelensky. He is by no means popular at all. I mean, he sent 1.8 million Ukrainian soldiers to their deaths in a war that shouldn't have been fought and could never be won. So how popular can the man be?
True.
He's got the secret police all over the country trying to sort of press people into military service.
Right.
And you've got housewives, mothers, daughters, sons, everybody's coming out to protect dad or their brother or something else and get rid of the secret police. So I think the issue for Ukraine right now is we want an end to this. And if we have to give up something, then we're prepared to do it because we must have an end to this terrible war. The other thing is that I'm sure the Ukrainians have been brainwashed into believing that everything on that map was granted to them in perpetuity. We all know the circumstances under which that crazy map was drawn when it was drawn. It's not consistent with history, with culture, with ethnicity, with language, or anything. And I think there are older Ukrainians that know that. But the bottom line is that I think the Ukrainians just want an end to it. Now, the Europeans, if I were a German watching this, I would be disgusted beyond belief. What are we doing? Merz looks like a child in kindergarten asking for permission to speak.
Right.
He speaks, he says something that Trump doesn't agree with, and he's essentially told, thank you for your interest in the conversation, go back to sleep. If you look at Georgia Maloney, I always get a charge out of her because she's always rolling her eyes and leaning to one side, like, what am I doing here? What's the purpose of this whole thing? Well, Georgia is the one with some common sense. She wants to get out of the European Union. Well, the European Union has turned out to be a tyranny. Everybody hates the damn thing because it's not satisfied with organizing trade across borders. They want to dictate what everybody's going to do in all of their schools, how they're going to live, what their so-called values are supposed to be. So the EU is a catastrophe. That's going to go away before NATO does, and then NATO will follow suit. The whole thing, in my judgment, marks the end of U.S. hegemony in Europe, the end of European subordination, if you will, to U.S. national leadership. Now, I'm sure that's not what President Trump wanted, or it's what he thinks, but that's really what it is. And I think most of the people in that room will be swept away in the near future in elections by new people that are going to come in and say, that's it, we've got to decide our own future. Who's going to determine the destiny of Germany, of Poland, of France, of Italy? It's got to be the people that live in those countries. Right. The other thing is, this is something nobody here seems to understand. The people that have the most at stake right now weren't even represented at the table. Who are the people that border Ukraine? Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Moldova, Romania. Where were they? What difference does it make what they decide in Washington, or what the French, the Germans, the British decide? What do the people that border Ukraine want? And that's where the focus ought to be. It should be Moscow with the people I just described. The only exception I would make is Germany, because the Germans have a long, long history in the region. It goes back 1,000 years. Right. So there's a legitimate place for them. As for the rest, forget it. They have nothing to say. Let them go. Now, if you want to drag in the Finns, you can. And I think you have a Finnish government that is totally delusional, that thinks it's threatened by Russia when it is not. So you could bring them in, but they have nothing to do with Ukraine. Mm. So I think we got to go back to the core states I just mentioned, plus Berlin. They've got to sit with Moscow. Now, we can support that. President Trump can stand up and say, I'm willing to support this, and I wish everybody well. We'll assist in whatever way we can, but otherwise, what have we got to do with it?
Right.
We're one of the people that started this war. In fact, we're mightily responsible for it. It'll end as soon as President Trump says, that's it, I'm out, which is exactly what he should have said already. Right. But I suppose he'll wait until Zelensky backstabs him and comes out publicly and says, I'm not going to agree to anything that you say. At which point in time, President Trump may finally wash his hands of him.
I think NATO membership is off the table. I think everyone has come to that realization. That's obviously a huge red line for Russia. But do you think that potentially EU membership could be an option for Ukraine? Would you see potentially these European countries trying to, somewhat give a lifeline to Ukraine in that regard?
You realize I think the EU and NATO will both go out of existence over the next year. I see no future for either of those organizations.
Okay.
For the reasons I've already cited.
Yeah.
I mean, Poles, they collectively despise the European Union. The Germans, who are usually blamed for the power and the influence of the European Union, are increasingly fed up with the European Union. The Italians want out. The Greeks would leave tomorrow morning. I mean, we just go down the list. Who are the people that are backing this stuff? It's the ones in the far west. The people like Sweden that wanted to get into this sort of thing. Now, the Norwegians, it was funny. Years ago, when I was serving at Supreme Headquarters of Allied Powers Europe, I asked a Norwegian general officer, I said, well, you're in NATO. Why aren't you in the EU?
Yeah.
He said, we will not be governed by Brussels. He said, people in Bergen in Norway who live north of Oslo don't trust anybody in Oslo. Why would they trust somebody in Brussels?
Right.
I think that's a good way to look at Europe right now. Mm-hmm. Europeans are in a fight for their existence, not with the Russians, with people inside their own country they never wanted. Right. They were forced on them by the European Union, von der Leyen and her friends.
Right.
and the World Economic Forum. Those people are the enemy, not Russia.
Right.
And that's the way more and more Europeans are seeing it. So the EU, in my judgment, is a dead end. It's going to go away. What will emerge in its place? I don't know, but it'll be something the Europeans can live with. And it may not involve all Europeans. It may only involve a subset. The same thing is true for NATO. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was essentially a North Atlantic affair. It has now become a continental alliance on the scale of World War I. And that's a catastrophe for everyone. That means that you're in some far off corner in northwestern Russia, and there's a dust up with the Finns, and that means the entire continent is at war. Who the hell wants that?
Right.
These old alliances were destructive, not helpful. Everybody wants really instinctively to get out from under them. So you may end up with a new regime, a new security arrangement, maybe Scandinavia plus the Baltic states, maybe not all the Baltic states, but some. It'll probably be Germany, along with perhaps the Czech Republic. We don't know. Right. You'll have something between Hungary and Poland. They have always cooperated whenever they could. They have a great deal of commonality in history and culture. They're very interested in what happens in Ukraine.
Right.
So if they're willing to step up and be part of this final negotiation for Ukrainian independence and sovereignty when this war ends, then I think that's a very good thing. And remember, there are parts of Ukraine which are historically Polish or Hungarian. So these are not minor affairs. That's why this whole notion of the people sitting in the Oval Office deciding the future is kind of ridiculous. They're really not the right people to be there.
I think we're looking at a situation where Europe doesn't really have a lot of cards per se, to use Trump's analogy. I mean, that's why I think they've all flown there. We have that iconic image of all the European leaders, sitting in a row, almost like they're getting lectured by, Daddy, as the NATO president referred to Donald Trump as. So,
but we know, and I'm sure that President Trump understands this very well, this war is going to be won by Russia. It's already being won on the battlefield. Right. So they're ultimately going to dictate the outcome. And I think he knows that. He's trying to tell Zelensky, which is an enormous waste of time, and he's trying to tell the other European leaders that were there, it's time to come to terms with reality. Things are dictated by the presence of military power on the ground. That military power is substantial. It is so substantial that neither the United States nor its allies can push it out. In addition, none of us in the United States and none of the Europeans that I'm aware of are interested in going to war with Russia.
Correct.
I mean, I listened to a Russian who said, well, Europeans want to see more Russians die. I don't think he's right at all. I've lived there for almost 10 years of my life. I know lots of them. I don't see any evidence that the Europeans are interested in killing Russians at all. If anybody is interested in that, these are the globalists that we've been talking about, these fools in the World Economic Forum. Right. Maybe fools at the top of NATO, but forget it. The average European wants this thing to get over.
Correct.
And they'll end it once and for all. So I think we need to say we really don't have any cards left unless we want to continue to throw huge quantities of money down a black hole. There's nothing in this for us. We just need to get out. And we really don't have any cards to play. And if somebody says, well, we're a nuclear power, then I would invite them to a rubber room in the nearest asylum, because none of us, neither Russians nor Americans, want to go to nuclear war over Ukraine or anything else for that matter.
Colonel, I've seen multiple reports that it says that in order to get this American U.S. security guarantees, you briefly touched on that before, but there's a report that said that Ukraine will promise to buy $100 billion worth of American weapons, which will be financed by the Europeans in order to win U.S. security guarantees. What do you make of that, these reports? And I mean, would that just not just be a continuation of what we've been doing for the past 3 years?
Effectively, it's stupidity on stilts. It completely ignores the reality of what the Russians will or will not accept. It presupposes that we can shove something down Moscow's throat that it doesn't want. And plus the fact, I don't see it happening. I think this money's going to dry up. It's going to be repurposed and go somewhere else. Now, I am concerned that We have wasted a great deal, and we may not have much flexibility left. I don't know. I'm talking about military power. But I noted the other day that we've dispatched 4,000 sailors and Marines in a task force, naval task force, to the Southern Caribbean, ostensibly for the purpose of potentially intervening against Maduro in Venezuela. Well, I would argue that if you're going to embark on these kinds of things, you probably need to trim back the sail in other areas.
Right.
So I don't know what people are thinking in Washington, but they continue to behave in many ways as though our power is limitless. And perhaps they think they can continue to debase our currency by printing it without interruption. That could be. Again, everybody who's tried that, the Spanish Empire, the British Empire, everybody else who's tried it ultimately went under.
Right.
I don't think that's a good idea. But the bottom line is I don't think we have very many cards to play. President Trump has already played his card. He's the leader of the most important country in the NATO alliance. He's the leader of a country with whom the Russians want good relations, just as he's made it very clear he wants good relations with Russia. So all this business about any foreign presence on Ukrainian soil, any foreign military intervention there, the introduction of U.S. armaments, that's all got to go away. That's an impossibility. And I think it will.
Yeah, I want to touch on that because another interesting thing we've heard, and there's so much confusion here, and the Europeans had said that they would like to have NATO Article 5 similar guarantees. So they're basically Article 5 like guarantees, but it not being NATO membership. It's so confusing because would that not just effectively be the same thing as admitting Ukraine into NATO?
Exactly. It's meaningless. It's stupid. It's unworthy of serious discussion.
Yeah.
Again, everybody that's looked at this, I certainly have for years. I go all the way back to 2014. And I was on RT and I was pilloried and attacked viciously for showing up on RT. But I went on there and they said, what do you think the solution is in Ukraine? And I said, we need a plebiscite. The people in Eastern Ukraine who are Russians should have the opportunity to vote themselves into Russia. And those who are Ukrainian need to stand up and identify themselves with the Ukrainian state. And I said, well, what happens if there's no plebiscite? I said, a war. Well, you've had it.
Right.
Okay. It's a done deal. Everything is on the table for Russia. We really have nothing more to say about it unless we want to risk a war with Russia.
Right.
Which I see no evidence for. So it's time to shut up and get out of the way and bring in the states that I mentioned earlier, not these people in Western Europe, the people that border Ukraine. We can host it anywhere they want. I mean, we could pay for the conference, okay?
Right.
But we need to suspend all further military aid. And I think that has to happen the moment Zelensky tells President Trump, I won't accept any deal that involves the loss of my quote-unquote territory.
Right.
Then you're on your own. Done. Out.
Colonel, I've got one final question here, and I want to kind of look towards the future here. I think the next step that Trump has said is he would like to see a meeting directly between Putin and Zelensky, a potential meeting. Obviously, Trump there as potentially an intermediary. What do you feel the chances of this happening? Do you think that Zelensky will meet face to face with Putin, and where would that meeting even be? And what are your kind of prospects for the future?
I don't know. Given Zelensky's current remarks, his public statements, that he will absolutely not surrender any territory under any circumstances, would suggest to me as president that this is a dead end. So why bother? You could make the offer, but beyond making the offer, I would do nothing unless you see clear, unambiguous evidence from Zelensky that he will go there and negotiate directly with President Putin for a peace arrangement that involves recognition of Luhansk, Donetsk, Crimea, plus most of the territory in Kherson and Zaporizhia. I'm sorry, but that's the way it has to be. Right. And if he's not prepared to do that, then I would say there's no point in meeting at all. And it may never occur as a result. I think it's a mistake for President Trump to put himself in a position where he could be humiliated. I thought he was humiliated in the Oval Office by Zelensky during that first encounter.
Hmm.
And I was surprised that, President Trump didn't signal to the local Secret Service to pick this little man up and remove him. That's number one. Number two, I would have asked, who the hell let this man in without a suit and tie?
Right.
Why did we allow this fool to come in costume? Who's he kidding? Is he from what battlefield did he come? It's absurd. It's just inappropriate. It's ridiculous. So I think he was humiliated once. I think he's far too tolerant. I think he should be quite prepared to cut bait and move on. So if he continues to make these statements that he will give up nothing and do nothing, then I think President Trump should simply tell President Putin, we've done all that we can, and he refuses to talk to you. We'll help in whatever way we can, but for the moment, I've decided to suspend all military aid and pull all Americans out. We've got thousands of people on the ground in Ukraine, Cyrus. Intelligence, military, contractor, they all need to get out.
Right.
This has been a big bonanza for that community, but it's been the death knell of Ukraine.
Colonel, one more question. Do you feel that this time in Washington, would you say it was a success? Do you think there's potential here that we're going to get to the end? Or do you really think this will end up being kind of a nothing burger and it's just going to lead again to more hardships on the battlefield and the ultimate Russian victory, which many military analysts predict simply because it has now transferred to a war of attrition for the last year and a half or so? What are your thoughts?
I think from the standpoint of the two leaders meeting and talking to each other, and on the basis of meetings that were held earlier, shortly after he became president, about normalizing relations with Russia, I think we should go back to that. And I think that these meetings were healthy and productive in that sense. Because at the end of the day, we have no vital strategic interest in Ukraine. None. Russia does not threaten Europe. That's absurd. It's a huge lie. As it becomes clearer in Europe that it's a lie, the people governing Europe, these globalist elites, will be gone. And as soon as Merz and his friends go away, I see a resumption, ultimately, of business, commercial ties, cultural ties between Germany and Russia. May not happen immediately, but it will.
Right.
And as I said before, NATO is now on life support. The EU is faltering badly. I think those things will ultimately vanish in favor of new arrangements that will have more staying power because at least they'll be European in origin. They will not be imposed from the outside.
Well, Colonel, I want to thank you so much for these insights today. We had a lot of news in the last couple of days on this, and I just appreciate your insights and knowledge. It's always great to talk with you. And, let's hope that we can come to a peace agreement and lasting peace in the region. And I think the message to Europe is also very important because you have to find a way to work with Russia because Russia's border is not going anywhere. Russia's going to be Europe's neighbor forever. So, you have to find a way to work with the Russians and find a way for peace.
Sure. Thanks, Cyrus.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Everyone, thank you for making it to this point of the video and spending time with us today here on YouTube. I want to give a huge thank you to Colonel Douglas Macgregor for his amazing insights, but also give a huge thank you to today's video sponsor, Nomad Capitalist. Now, if you're interested in learning more about our multipolar world, click here to watch our next video. Leave us a comment down below. Thank you all for your support, and I look forward to seeing you all in our next video soon.